Hello and welcome to Breaking Down History. My name is Mr. Pritchard.
And I'm Dr. Dickens.
And today we're going to be discussing the question, why did anti-Semitism become so common in 19th and 20th century Europe? So, before we go any further, the key term that we're looking at today, one you may be familiar with, is anti-Semitism. So what is anti-Semitism?
Well, anti-Semitism is the hatred of Jews. Now, people have unfortunately hated Jewish people for centuries. However, it's not always been hatred on the basis of religion. We're going to look at several different reasons why anti-Semitism grew in Europe during this period.
And which periods of history are we looking at?
We'll take a look at the 19th and the early 20th centuries up to the 1930s.
So why stop at the 1930s? Why are we focusing on this bit?
Well, during this period, the 19th century and the early 20th century, anti-Semitism became more and more common in Europe. This led up to the 1930s and the 1940s and the Holocaust, which was the deliberate murder of 6 million Jews in Europe. Now, the Holocaust is going to be the focus of next week's podcast, but we need to have this background to properly understand what it was and how it might have started to come about.
Okay, so is there anything else we should be aware of when we're talking about anti-Semitism?
Yeah, there's two things. First of all, anti-Semitism describes the hatred of Jewish people. But it's not just the hatred of Jewish people because they had a different religion. People found different reasons to hate Jewish people. Some of these reasons were to do with religion, but some were to do with specific events, for example, the First World War, and some were to do with new ideas, for example, race. There's another reason as well, another thing that we need to be aware of. And this is when we're trying to explain why people hated Jews, we're trying to explain it, we're trying to give the reasons. We're not saying that these people's ideas about Jews were right, or they were correct, or they were acceptable. They weren't. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism, and like all racism, it's wrong and it's harmful. Like all racism, it's also based on false ideas. The ideas that these anti-Semites, as we're going to call them, had about Jews were all based on what they believed about Jews. They weren't based on any real facts about how Jewish people actually were or how they lived their lives. And as we'll see throughout this podcast, the things that anti-Semites believed about Jews were all based on ignorance and lies.
Okay, so as always, we are thinking about how you want to take notes. So what we would like you to do for this exercise is to do a mind map or a spider diagram. And at the centre of that, you need to have your key question from today's lesson. Why did anti-Semitism become so common in the 19th and 20th century Europe? And then we need 4 branches or links coming off of the mind map. One looking at religion, one looking at race, one looking at World War I, and one looking at anti-Semitic governments. Okay, so the first topic that we're going to be looking at for your mind map is religion. So the question that we sort of really need to ask is, why might religion lead to anti-Semitism?
Well, for pretty much over 1 millennium, Europe has been a mainly Christian continent. And Christians in Europe have had many common ideas about Jews in the past. One idea is that Jews were responsible for killing Jesus. Now, actually, this isn't true. If we go back to the Bible, then we'll see, according to the story of crucifixion, it was actually the Romans who were guilty of killing Jesus. But there is that idea that it was Jews who killed Jesus. Another idea is that Jews had strange religious practices. Now, one of these practices was called blood libel. And blood libel involved Christian children's blood being taken by Jewish people to put into bread for the religious celebration of Passover. Now, again, this is completely untrue. This didn't happen. In fact, if we look at the laws in Jewish religion, there are rules against murder, there are rules against blood sacrifice, there are rules even against the consumption of blood. So the idea of blood libel doesn't make any sense, but it was one that Christians often had about Jewish people.
So a lot of these ideas that people are believing about Judaism is false. Why did people believe them though? Why did people sort of fall for these lies?
Well, there's a few different possible reasons. One is that Jewish people often appeared different. So some Jewish people might have worn different clothes, they had different types of religious worship, they spoke often different languages to other people in Europe, and for this reason Christian people in Europe often feared Jews. Another reason is that religious leaders, Christian religious leaders, accepted these false ideas about Jewish people. One example is Martin Luther, a famous Protestant leader in the 16th century. And he wrote that Jews killed Christian children for blood. Again, we know this isn't true, but if people like Martin Luther were saying this, then these ideas became more popular and more commonly believed.
So these ideas are coming from the top down, they're coming from the top of society.
Many of them are, yes.
Yeah. So how do Christians' negative views lead to anti-Semitic actions? If they've got these ideas, how does this actually take place, this violence?
Well, from the medieval times onwards, there were violent attacks against Jewish people, known as pogroms. These happened all over Europe. They began, as I said, in the medieval times, and one example is in the English city of Norwich in 1144. In Norwich, a young boy was discovered stabbed to death in local woods. There was a small Jewish community in Norwich, and they were blamed, even though there was no evidence that they'd had any involvement. The Jewish community were threatened by the local population, and eventually they had to be protected by the local government. However, in the years following this alleged attack in Norwich, people across all of England began to blame Jews for the murder of children. And this led to violent attacks against other Jewish communities as well.
I remember reading a while ago how Edward I as well, he expels all the Jews from England eventually. So there's this hatred sort of sweeping through the country. Did these attacks on Jews just happen in the medieval period?
No, they continue all the way up into the 20th century. One of the worst examples of a pogrom was the Kishinev pogrom in 1903. Now, Kishinev is a city in Moldova, and in 1903 it was part of the Russian Empire. In 1903, a Christian boy had been murdered in the city just before Easter. There was a pogrom, violent rioting, which broke out a few days later. After 3 days of rioting, 50 Jewish people in Kishinev had been murdered and hundreds more had been injured.
So these pogroms sound pretty horrific.
Yeah.
Were there any places where they were worse? It was worse to be a Jewish person?
Well, by the 20th century, the areas in Europe which had the worst cases of anti-Semitism tended to be Eastern Europe, and in particular in the Russian Empire. This is partly because the government in Russia was itself anti-Semitic, and some people in the government actively helped pogroms. For example, police might have allowed riots to happen. Some government officials also helped spread false rumours, lies, about Jews, which led to pogroms.
Okay, so the second thing that we're going to talk about is the idea of race and anti-Semitism. Race has always existed. Racism has always existed, right? So how does this impact on Jewish people?
Well, actually, racism as an idea hasn't really always been around. The modern idea that we have about human races only really began in the 1800s. And it really started when a man called Charles Darwin started looking at evolution and how different species of animals developed. Some people took Darwin's ideas and they applied them to humans to argue that there were some stronger and some weaker races in the human race. And they argued that the stronger races would naturally win against the weaker races. Now, this idea became known as social Darwinism. It's an extremely unpleasant racist idea, and it was used, for example, in the 19th century to argue that white Europeans were stronger and more intelligent than non-white people, for example, black people from Africa. Again, this is a completely false, incorrect idea.
Okay, so what racial ideas, how did they impact on Jewish people? How did they change the way that people saw Jewish people?
Well, anti-Semitism is connected with racism because in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, some anti-Semites started to use the idea of race to argue that Jews had certain natural characteristics or things that were particular about them. For example, they argued that Jews, because of their race, were naturally disloyal or untrustworthy or dangerous to people in the countries that they lived in.
Okay, but these ideas aren't true. That's what we know, isn't it? We know these ideas aren't true. These are dangerous ideas, and these are ideas that are based on sort of ignorance and sort of, I guess, just a lack of knowledge. What else could we say about this?
Well, they're as you say, they're completely false ideas. And this idea about Jewish people being a race is sort of revolved around some false ideas about Jewish people. One was that Jews couldn't be trusted and they were dangerous. And this was an idea that we'd already seen with Christian anti-Semitism, religious anti-Semitism in medieval times, for example, with the blood libel. But now anti-Semites started using the idea of race to explain why this might be. And the other false idea is that there were stronger and weaker human races. It's just not true. There's absolutely no scientific evidence to support that.
Okay, so why are racial ideas about Jews so important when we think about anti-Semitism?
They're really important if we want to understand how anti-Semites started to change their ideas about Jews. Anti-Semites who were racists, who believed in this idea of race, argued now that Jews could never change what they were. Before the idea of race, so before this, if a Jew became a Christian, then they were no longer Jewish because they'd changed their religion. As soon as we have the idea of race brought in, though, that stops being the case. The idea of race meant that even if a Jew changed their religion, they were still Jewish and they still couldn't be trusted and they were still dangerous. And some people use this idea to argue that they would have to get rid of Jews altogether from their countries and perhaps even kill Jews.
So the next thing we're going to talk about is the effect of World War I on anti-Semitism and the effect it had on the Jewish community. We've all studied World War I before. Hopefully you remember doing it earlier in the year. What can we remember about World War I? It starts in 1914. What happens then?
Well, from 1914, countries all across Europe went to war with each other. Now, this war lasted for 4 years, all the way up until 1918. It was the most destructive war in Europe's history up to that point, pretty much. Almost 40 million people killed or wounded. In the end, Germany and Austria-Hungary lost that war. Austria-Hungary no longer existed as a country, and the Russian Empire collapsed and turned into the Soviet Union, the USSR.
Okay, so you've got this defeat of Germany, you've got the Russian Empire collapsing, but how does this lead to World War I increasing anti-Semitism?
Well, many people in Europe, first of all, blamed Jews for what had happened during and after the war. Some people argued, for example, that Jewish people had made lots of money from the war, whilst others had been out fighting and dying. So Jewish people were getting rich at the same time.
And this isn't true, is it? This is based on a stereotype about Jewish people.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a lie. Many Jewish soldiers we know fought and died in World War I. They suffered just as much as other people.
And they were proud to be German.
Yeah, many of them, yeah.
So what other anti-Semitic ideas were there after World War I?
Well, another idea was that in Germany, people blamed Jews for Germany losing the war. They argued that Germany would have won the war, but it was actually stabbed in the back by people who were disloyal to the German people in Germany, especially Jews. Now, this became known as the stab in the back myth.
Okay, so you've got this myth of the betrayal from the Jewish population. Is there any truth to this?
None whatsoever. Many Jewish people, as we've already said, fought bravely in the First World War for Germany. And we also know that Germany wasn't going to win the war. The army was beaten already quite a long time before the war ended.
So they're essentially looking for scapegoats, looking for people to blame.
Exactly.
And it just happens that the Jews are the focus for that. Okay, so what about ideas involving the Jewish community and communism?
Well, after the First World War, as we said, the Russian Empire disappeared and it was replaced by a new country, the Soviet Union. Now, this was the first communist country in the world. Some people in Europe argued that communists were Jews, and they used communism as proof that Jews were trying to take over the world. They said there was proof of this because some important communists, like a man called Leon Trotsky, were themselves Jewish.
So this is another lie, obviously, something else is false. This links to other conspiracies you have about Jewish people now, isn't it? This idea that they're controlling things around the world and they're trying to take over. This is one of the sort of anti-Semitic tropes that has followed Jewish people.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so was there any truth to this at all? Obviously, Trotsky was a Jewish person, but was there any truth to this?
Well, if we look at communists in Russia and elsewhere in the world, some were Jews, but most weren't Jewish, and most Jews as well weren't communists. So basically, no, it's not true.
Okay, so in particular, if we're looking at Europe, you've mentioned Germany. Were there any countries that saw other countries that saw more anti-Semitism?
Well, the main countries really that saw a growth in anti-Semitism after World War One were Germany and Austria. Remember, these are the two countries that have lost the war, and they're countries which were forced to give up land and money to other countries. People in Germany and Austria were really angry. They wanted someone to blame, and when people want someone else to blame for their problems, we say they make a scapegoat out of that person. In other words, they turn that person into something that they can blame for problems that these people are suffering. Some people in Germany and Austria chose to blame Jews for what was happening in their countries. Therefore, they made Jews scapegoats. But it's just not true, the sort of things they were saying about Jewish people.
Okay, so we've discussed some of the different anti-Semitic ideas, but where were these anti-Semitic ideas? Where were these anti-Semitic actions coming from? Who was responsible for this?
Well, often it was governments who were creating these ideas, and they were promoting these ideas in their countries. And we need to take a look at some of the anti-Semitic governments that came about after World War One. It was the leaders of these countries who were really encouraging anti-Semitic ideas, often not the ordinary people in these countries themselves. Now, straight after World War One, there were a number of anti-Semitic governments which came to power. One example was in Hungary. Now, the Hungarian government was ruled by a military general called Miklos Horthy, and after World War One, he was strongly anti-Semitic. In 1920, Horthy passed a law which limited the number of Jews who could go to university. Now, this was really important because it effectively meant that Jewish people in Hungary had fewer rights than other Hungarians.
Okay, so this is an example of an anti-Semitic government in Hungary, but the most obvious example is the one that we know of in Germany. Why was Germany more anti-Semitic than other countries? How is it different to other countries?
Well, in Germany, some people, and often people who were in power, people in the army and in the government, had blamed Jews for losing World War One. This was called, as we said before, the stab in the back myth. Several political parties in Germany were openly anti-Semitic, and the most successful anti-Semitic party after the First World War was the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler. In 1929, the German economy collapsed. Many ordinary Germans lost their jobs and their money, and Hitler and the Nazis promised to give people back their work and their jobs. They also blamed Jewish people for the problems that Germany was suffering. Now, people in Germany, by about 1929, 1930, because they were suffering, once again, many people were prepared to accept the idea of scapegoats. They were prepared to accept the idea that someone else might be causing their problems. And so Hitler and the Nazi Party won a lot of support. In January 1933, they won an election and they were brought to power.
So once they're in power, this Nazi Party, how do they start to make the lives of Jewish people worse?
Well, between 1933 and 1938, there were a number of policies to separate or exclude Jewish people from German society. These included boycotts of shops, stopping people from shopping at Jewish-owned shops, burning books that had been written by Jews, and laws which discriminated against Jews or treated Jews differently. One example of these laws was in 1935, called the Nuremberg Laws, and these said that Jews were a race and it made it difficult, and in fact illegal, for Jews and non-Jews to marry or have children together. Now, after 1938, Nazi policies started to move in a more violent and really very, very threatening direction. And they started to aim to destroy Jews in Germany. Their aim was really to get rid of them, either by killing them or by forcing them to leave the country. And this leads on to the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jews, which we'll look at next week.
Okay, so overall, we've looked at these 4 different key reasons. Why did anti-Semitism grow in modern Europe?
Well, we've seen, as you said, several reasons. First of all, we've got the very, very long-standing idea that Christians had, which were religious ideas about Jewish people. So we've seen that Christians in Europe held anti-Semitic ideas for a long time. Secondly, later on than that, in the 19th and 20th century, the idea of race became more and more popular amongst certain groups in society and certain politicians. And people used the idea of race as an excuse to explain and justify their hatred of Jews. And we need to say again, as we've said right the way through this podcast, these ideas about Jews, whether their race, whether their religion, absolutely are not based on facts. Finally, we looked at the First World War. Now, the First World War made many people angry and fearful, especially in countries like Austria and Hungary and Germany. And these governments in these countries often used Jews as scapegoats to blame them essentially for losing the war. Now, I've spoken an awful lot. I'm just going to flip this over. I want to ask Mr. Pritchard a question here. Based on what we've discussed, what do you think made anti-Semitism in modern Europe, really the 19th and 20th century, different to anti-Semitism in early periods of history?
Well, as you said, religion was always there, but the thing that's new here is this idea of race, this idea that Jewish people are a different race to them, and the fact that this means that Jewish people cannot change, so they can't become any less Jewish if they convert to Christianity, or even if they were sort of living in a country for hundreds of years, they're always going to be Jewish. And this poses a lot of problems. You mentioned things like, the Nuremberg laws. I guess as well, you can't have Jewish people marrying into other families. So there's no way of escaping persecution. And then you've got this problem where people in Europe are beginning to argue that maybe they should get rid of them altogether, maybe even kill them. I think what's really important from what we talked about today is the fact that we're not talking about anti-Semitism being this thing that just appears in the 1930s with the Nazis. It's something that has existed for a long, long time, and as Dr. Dickens pointed out, has definitely took on a life of its own after this idea of race sort of presented itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, next time we're going to take a look at the Holocaust, and this really follows on from these later anti-Semitic ideas. And as Mr. Pritchard has said, the idea that because Jews, in some people's minds, were a race, in order to get rid of Jewish people, they would have to be physically removed or even killed in Europe. So we'll take a look at that next time.